Thanks so much for that introduction, and it's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to hear all these amazing presentations. What a lot to think about. My goodness. So as was just mentioned, I'm an anthropologist who works in the built environment, and at the moment working with property asset management companies and development teams to help them create spaces and experiences that deliver something called social value, but specifically value to both business and to society. So actually, how do we deliver and create spaces that actually work for business, but also for society at large? And COVID has really illuminated the need to think about value. It's illuminated social inequalities and financial precarity in towns and cities. And city makers increasingly are aware of their responsibility to address these divisions and situations that people now find themselves in. So what am I going to speak about today? Next slide. Blurred boundaries, making cities in a digital age. So this talk is going to address the intersection between technological and the social in the context of the built environment, specifically how technology is being used to address social issues, such as big one in the built environment at the moment is loneliness. So social issues such as that at the same time, technology shapes our lives, our social lives and experiences of the people living and working in cities. So actually, how is it both addressing and shaping our lived experience? So I'm going to address the following challenges and questions. Digital disruption. So, big issue in the built environment at the moment. It's a challenge for all of us, and we're living it at the moment, which is technology is taking us away from spaces, physical spaces. So it's throwing into the question the value of some physical spaces, specifically retail spaces. We're currently the office space, for example. But technology is also being seen as a solution to address this issue of lack of footfall in physical environments. So actually, how do we use technology to attract people back to physical spaces? And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. The attraction and need for shared space. Again, we're in a moment where the kind of spaces that people are wanting and attracted to are spaces that allow them to come together collectively. And then that is kind of an associated question of why people are coming together and what that coming together looks like in the context of community and how technology helps shape that, but also how these new communities and notions of community can shape the technological solutions that are coming to the fore. So broadly, this talk talks about new ways of imagining and enacting community as a useful way of thinking about how we design and implement technological solutions. Great. We know that technology is changing the way we live and work. I think, as I mentioned, we're all living that at the moment. Next slide. This is particularly felt, has historically been felt in spaces such as libraries. There's a picture of the library here on the left, which have been in decline, experienced declining visitor numbers over the last, 10 years or so. Other spaces such as retail spaces also experiencing decline in footfall as we're doing our shopping online. And currently the office is also emerging as a space, the value of which has been thrown into question currently as we're all working at a distance from the office in our homes and other such spaces. So, in addressing, these changing consumer needs and kind of the emergence of different spaces in which we can live, work and play, has driven companies to think about what consumer wants and how to think about addressing emerging and evolving consumer needs. And that's where companies like my own company, Human City, and other companies come into play to help understand that consumer experience and explore how physical spaces can and still play a role and have a purpose in people's lives and in helping people perform certain functions. Next slide. And of course, as I said, we're all experiencing COVID-19, and that's further thrown into question the value of physical spaces and real estate. And the ONS reports that in April 2020, nearly half of people in the UK were doing some kind of work from home, and with the vast majority of these home workers stating that this was because of the COVID pandemic. Next slide. And where are we all working? 60% of us are now working from home. So COVID-19 is rewriting the rules, and cities and city makers are rapidly adjusting to this new normal, reviewing the development decisions already in plan. So we all know that the built environment is already kind of worked out. We know development is already in process for physical spaces we'll occupy in the next 20 and 30 and 50 years. So city makers are now reviewing their development decisions, the kind of projects that are in the pipeline, to assess whether those are the right projects, whether the spaces that we imagined that we might need are still going to be the spaces we need as a result of this pandemic. So there will undoubtedly be need for less office space in city centres and potentially requirement for new amenities. Next slide. And this has a knock-on effect. So real estate assets are depreciating in value. This is just a graph to show you how in the last, few months, this is a real estate investment trust, how actually the real value of retail and the hospitality industry, the property in those areas is declined in value quite significantly, by half in some cases. Next slide. So what's the solution? So what's being mooted as the solution to actually kind of addressing the value of physical space? So I'm going to touch on this idea of network effect. Next slide. What is network effect? Network effect is when a network effect is present, the value of a product or service increases according to the number of others using it. So that raises the question, how can we use technology, specifically mobile data and mobile technology, to understand what is hot and what is not, where people are and where they're not, and use it to influence behavior, and how do people themselves, the consumers, use it to understand which spaces they should visit and which they won't. Next slide. So this is a heat map of central London. This is something I just got from the internet. It's very easy to find these diagrams, providing information on the most popular runs. And so this is both the documentation of behaviour. So it's a mobile app. It's a Nike training app that collates and collects data on where people are running, but also reinforces behaviours. Of course, as people see where other people are running, certain routes become more popular than others. So you can see how data here has been used to shift people to certain areas of the city, which is a useful way of thinking about how we can get ultimately people back to physical spaces in the long run. Next slide. And again, this is another image taken from the web. This is the app 2, and this is a kind of social networking app which it logs when people are logging into the app and notifies other users of the app as to where those people are. So the idea is it's a way of notifying others who are on the platform as to where the places are to meet and to hang out. And of course, you've got a heat map here indicating where the most popular areas are in London. Next slide. So the point is that property managers and building operators are beginning to look to these new technologies to think about, how do we get people back into physical spaces? How can these technologies be used to not only track and trace where people are physically going, but also to influence behaviour and get people back into spaces, retail spaces, potentially office environment also in the future. And so there's increased reliance on social networks to make physical spaces more valuable to consumers. And this is a technique adopted by public libraries, retail industry, residential buildings alike. Next slide. So the next section, I'm going to talk about increased popularity of shared space, particularly because it's not just technology that's bringing us back to spaces, but also the need to congregate, collect with others in what's now called shared spaces. And then I'm going to turn to the concept of community that's emerging out of these shared spaces, and how we can think about what people are doing in practice in the context of community, and use that as a model for thinking about technology and technological design. Next slide. So while mobile technology is driving people back to spaces, physical assets, so is the need to connect, the social driver to actually kind of meet and practice and spend time together. And some work that we did, Human City, we surveyed and interviewed people about their experience of shared spaces, and most people stated that they valued shared space because it was an opportunity for them to socialise. Next slide. And in Northern and Central Europe, people enjoy hanging out and learning from others. And these are some of the activities they do in shared spaces. This is just a few of them. And this is obviously pre-COVID, so this might have changed. But prior to COVID, this is the reason why people are using shared spaces. Next slide. And people like the convenience of not only using spaces for one function, but actually multiple functions. I think we've touched on this in previous presentations, but actually the kind of spaces people are attracted to are spaces in which they can do multiple tasks. So they're not just attracted to a workspace, but actually attracted to a space in which they can work and live and potentially eat. And so there's increasing overlap between different, I guess, sectors and kind of functions that might be addressed in different spaces. Some of these spaces that address multiple or multi-use spaces are often called neighborhoods. And the point being that co-location has become more important than ever. And it's not, and the underlines the fact that actually spaces are not destinations in themselves. It's the activities we do in spaces that are becoming more important. Next slide. And this idea of multi-use is underpinning the 50-minute city. I'm sure many of you have come across this now in newspapers and various other kind of debates around how are we going to reinvent the city in a post-COVID world. And actually kind of this emphasis on localized economies and kind of shrinking distances to about 15 to 20 minutes. So that people can spend more time together and obviously reduce the distance between work and where they live. But of course, that places much more emphasis on how we're using our spaces effectively in multiple ways. So, you know, during the day, a space might be a restaurant. During the evening, a space might be a restaurant. During the day, it might be a workplace, etc. So increased emphasis on usability and flexibility there. Next slide. So a quick recap, I've talked about digital disruption, the use of mobile technology to attract people to particular spaces, and also the attractiveness of shared space and multi-use spaces in a digital age. And so in the last few minutes, I'm going to talk about, next slide, the importance of community. And so this is a project we did at Human City, and I'm specifically going to talk about how can emerging ideas of community be used to inform the design of digital technology as techniques for connection and engagement, both online and offline. Next slide. So our aim in this project at Human City was to examine the overlapping and divergent ways in which staff and residents imagine and do living together in a building in London. Next slide. And our task was to make recommendations on how to improve people's experiences of living together and understand whether room size, particularly the size of people's rooms in a very kind of compact living environment, had any impact on people's experiences of collective living. Next slide. We spent a great deal of time with people in their rooms and carried out participant observation by living with people and residents in this shared living space. Next slide. And we explored the interrelationship between people who were living there, the purpose, the function of that space, specifically for the people living there, and the place, why they were living there, how they were living there, and the interrelationships between living, working, and other kinds of activities. Next slide. And we discovered that people create and sustain community in three main ways. I'll go into those in a little bit more detail. Next slide. The ideological and the everyday. So community was imagined as something, but also as a problem solver, a way of problem solving and providing mutual support. So on the one hand, you had staff who had this idea of community being something quite ideological, as out there to be discovered, to kind of to tap into, whereas actually residents discovered that community was something they did every day through sharing, through cooking together, through working together, sharing space, resolving problems, etc. Next slide. And there was a temporal and spatial aspect of community. So the idea that actually, you know, you're on CCTV, smile, you know, so collective living is notoriously quite public, but actually people were negotiating space quite differently and using spaces to gather in smaller groups, using bookable rooms in order to kind of to establish that boundary between public and private a little bit more. Next slide. And of course, people are doing the same online. We actually found that people are using WhatsApp and Facebook quite effectively to gather into small groups to negotiate their relationship between public and private. And that's something called Scalable Sociality, which is well known in anthropological theory. But the idea and ways in which people use social media to engage as a collective in different ways and with different groups. Next slide. Next slide. So these three main ways of making sustaining community were actually also seen as a way of making home. So people were negotiating these different ways of community and communal living as a way of in their own words, making home. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is community isn't just one thing. It was multiple things to different people and highly complex in the way it was being negotiated and managed. And people were coming together and creating and making meaning in the co-living space in different ways. Next slide. And so the complexity of social forms, such as community, whilst shared, will have multiple meanings and interpretations. And so I'm going to end with a provocation, which is I've explored digital technology and how it's been used to address social challenges and real estate issues, but also ask the question, how does it shape and mold the experiences of people living and working in cities? In an age of digital disruption and network effects, it's important to consider the multiple ways in which communities imagined and acted in practice, and the ways in which such imaginaries can, should and could be used to model a technological design and networking practices. Thanks so much.